and welcome back to Part 3 of Chapter 9, Redefining a Nation. By now, we've gotten into the year 1816. A new president has been elected, James Monroe, and he wins hands down. What happens is, if you remember, we talked about the end of the War of 1812. The Federalist Party has pretty much disappeared. That only leaves one party in power, the Democratic Republicans. And we were already seeing that the party was already starting to kind of split into different factions. And this is a term called the era of good feelings, but don't let this deceive you. This is not everybody kind of skipping hand in hand into the sunshine. It's not like that. Politics are still pretty heated, but there's just now one party. So what we see is, with the election of James Monroe, he's a veteran of the Revolution. He's a Democrat. He's the last of the Founding Fathers, the last of that Virginia dynasty, those presidents coming from the state of Virginia. Remember, all of our presidents except one, the second, John Adams, all of them have been from Virginia. Adams himself is from Massachusetts. And so this guy had been a veteran of the Revolution. He was twice governor of Virginia. He was a representative that represented the U.S. in London, Madrid, Paris, you name it. He's got a hefty CV, basically. And he was known for his real honesty and praised for his integrity, but he wasn't really seen as kind of this outstanding intellect. He wasn't someone like James Madison or Thomas Jefferson. And he really wasn't seen as being really a forceful leader. But everyone could pretty much agree to his character. He seemed like a good guy, so evidently he must have been doing something well. Let's talk about expanding our nation's borders and settling up with other nations where our boundaries end and begin. If you remember, we bought all that large land from France, and now we're trying to determine with Great Britain and Spain where our lands end and begin. So if you remember, at the end of the War of 1812, no land changes hands whatsoever. Everything goes back to the status quo. And so for years, along the American-Canadian border, there had been no real trouble. Remember also that Canada is still a colony of Great Britain. And what we see is, even after the war, there's no real grudge between these two nations, Great Britain and the United States. But after the war, they do start trying to build up their fortifications along the Great Lakes area and along the Canadian border. However, it becomes pretty obvious to both nations that it's too expensive to do this. And so what happens is, the Americans and the British kind of come together, and they first kind of start talking about demilitarizing along the Great Lakes. And this is going to be known as the Rush-Bagot Treaty Agreement of 1817. And what happens is they eventually not only just limit this to the Great Lakes, but they expand it along the 3,000-mile border of Canada and the U.S. And with this, they'll also have a convention of 1818, which really kind of sets the 49th parallel as the northern border of the Louisiana Territory. And also what they agreed to, if you can see in the map, of course I think my picture's blocking it, the Oregon country. Both the United States and Great Britain would jointly control this for about 10 years. So with this, again, we've established the northern boundary of the United States and Canada, that land that we had bought from France, that area. So again, we've established this with Great Britain. With Spain and its territory, it's going to be a little bit of a different story. Spain has control still of Florida, and of course it still has the Spanish Empire out west, but it's pretty obvious to most people that they have feeble control over areas, especially in the Floridas. The western part of Florida had already passed into American hands by 1813, and what we see is already frontiersmen from Georgia are already trying to make encroachments into the remaining eastern part of it. The thing about Florida, and if you remember when we talked about the War of 1812, Florida was, again, kind of seen as an area that many Americans wanted to get a hold of, especially in the South. One of the reasons was the Seminole Indians would make raids into Georgia and surrounding areas and then retreat across the boundary line into Florida, and the United States couldn't pursue them. And what we also saw was thousands of escaped slaves are making their way through the South to Florida, and again, the U.S. authorities can't go in and get them. What we see is Indian attacks along the Georgia-Florida boundary became so bad that President Monroe actually authorized Andrew Jackson, if you remember from the War of 1812, from Tennessee, to actually go in and crush the Seminoles completely, rid them off U.S. soil. And if that meant going into Spanish territory, so be it. And Andrew Jackson he didn't need any more encouragement. He pursues the Seminoles into Spain and actually ends up taking 2 Spanish forts pretty much without a fight. So when word gets back to Madrid, the capital of Spain, it's pretty obvious that they're not going to be able to control this territory much longer, and there's going to be a power vacuum, and the United States will quickly fill this power vacuum within this area. So what the Spanish are really more afraid of is not so much losing Florida, but the rest of their Latin American empire, especially the northern provinces of Mexico. What we saw was both nations now had to come together to determine where the Louisiana Territory ended and the Spanish and Mexico really began. So again, it was a toss-up. And what we have is John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, son of John Adams, serving under James Monroe, excuse me. What happens is he sits down with the Spanish minister, and they try to slowly go back and forth determining where these borders would be. And at one point, the Spanish ambassador wants the border to be where it's in the middle part of what is present-day Louisiana. But we continuously press the Spanish minister to get basically the boundary along the Sabine, Red, and Arkansas rivers to the Continental Divide and the 42nd parallel to the Pacific. So what we see is Spain said they would give up Florida if we really would accept the Louisiana Spain said they would give up Florida if the U.S. would accept the Louisiana territory boundary east of the Rio Grande. So what happens is we actually get what we want. It's, of course, obvious that the Spanish won't be able to defend this, and they're trying to get the best deal possible. So what happens is they do agree to this new boundary along the Sabine, Red, and Arkansas rivers. And what happens is the U.S. agrees to buy Florida from them for $5 million. However, this money doesn't go to Spain. It goes to Americans who currently hold claims against the Spanish government. So what happens is this becomes known as the Transcontinental Treaty, where we finally settled our boundary of Louisiana Territory with the Spanish Empire. As I told you before, Spain is worried about their Latin American colonies. And what we see is, during the Napoleonic Wars, Spain was pretty much under the control of France. And with this, their territories in the New World began to rise up in rebellions. So throughout 1810 and 1822, Spain's colonies again are rising in rebellion, declaring their independence. So out of this empire, we see such nations as Mexico, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador coming to existence. And with this, it's also inspiring a wave of sympathy throughout the U.S. because we too were a colonial people who rebelled against our colonial masters. With this, there is a new understanding that the U.S. needs to take a firmer approach in these areas. So in 1822, the Monroe administration comes up with extending recognition to many of these new republics. So we're recognizing these new nations. We're no longer seeing them as being part of the Spanish Empire. So after the Napoleonic Wars, Spain tries to come and reassert its control in these areas, and what they see is they're not able to really hold on to these areas anymore, and Spain had always been more interested in getting tribute out of their colonies than anything else. They weren't interested in doing what the British had been interested in doing in North America. So what we see is we're afraid Spain and other European powers will come back, try to take over. Other European powers taking over where Spain failed, and so setting up new colonies. So what we see is the Monroe Doctrine, as it becomes known, is actually fashioned by John Quincy Adams, again, son of John Adams. And it has 3 parts, and it's known as the Monroe Doctrine. And you can kind of see this cartoon illustrating it with Uncle Sam standing astride North America and South America, daring anyone to come over and try to set up colonies. So the first part is the U.S. would oppose any efforts of Europeans to colonize the Americas. So that was off the board. Also, if European nations agreed to this, the U.S. said it would stay out of any kind of European wars in the future. And again, Europeans are told to keep out of the affairs of Latin American countries. Now, why exactly I should say, is the United States doing it? Is because we're trying to be friendly, or are we trying to act as the big protector? The thing is, John Adams was actually hoping that we could come in and fill the void with our own manufacturing, extending loans to these new republics. So again, we were wanting to benefit from this, and we were wanting to keep European rivals out of, in a sense, our what we saw as our own backyard. So again, it just wasn't due to how can I put it, friendly inter-nation relations. It wasn't quite like that. It was more along the lines of what would serve us, what would benefit us. So again, this is the Monroe Doctrine, in which we're telling other Europeans, I should say, to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. We reserve the right to protect these nations. Let's talk about the American system of not manufacturers, it's the American system. Do not get this confused, I almost fell into it, with the American system of manufacturers. That is something totally different. This is the American system. What we saw at the end of the War of 1812 was the U.S. was far from being an integrated nation. If you remember, we had no U.S. bank, so that meant we had no uniformed currency. Our transportation was horrible. So we couldn't move goods and troops back and forth across the country. And also, with peace coming, that meant our manufacturers, what little manufacturing we had to compete with cheap British manufactured goods that were now coming in. So before the war, there was a plan, and it was outlined by the Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, to really plan for a system of roads and canals. So before the war, there was, again, these plans. But what happens is this plan just kind of fell apart between regional rivalries and the call that the U.S. government was exercising too much power that it didn't deserve. What we see is when James Monroe makes his annual message to Congress, the State of the Union, he actually revives this plan. And it becomes known as the American system. And Henry Clay, if you remember, Henry Clay was one of those young war hawks. He actually coins the term, this American system. And so this plan called for a new national bank, because remember, Alexander Hamilton's bank, the charter expired in 1811, a tariff on manufactured goods, and federal support for improved roads and canals. So this improving of roads and canals, building roads and canals, this will be known as internal improvements. What happens is the internal improvements became the most controversial part of the plan. Why is that? Well, again, there was nothing spelt out in the Constitution that the federal government could do this. So a lot of strict constructionists were saying, if it's not in the Constitution, we can't do it. What happens is Congress enacts an improvement plan only to have it vetoed by the president. So they get all this together, and they even come over the obstacle of the internal improvements through the necessary clause in the Constitution that Alexander Hamilton had used to get his bank. They get it through, present it to the president, and James Madison just vetoes the thing. And they're kind of shocked by this. And why was James Monroe doing this? Why, if he was pushing the plan, he vetoes his own plan? Because for James Madison, it had to be in the Constitution, or else the federal government couldn't do it. So Madison wants amendments to the government amendments to the Constitution before it starts to build. Other parts of his plan actually become law. We get the Tariff of 1816, which offers protection to American goods, and in 1816, we get a new charter of the Bank of the United States. Just like the first bank in the United States, the second bank was controversial with many, and it also became the center of a lot of public resentment. Like the first bank, it was going to be a private corporation that issued paper money, it collected taxes, and paid the government debts. However, it was also charged with ensuring that paper money issued from other banks had real value. What are we talking about here? Basically, banks at this time could issue their own paper money. And with the success of the market revolution, now banks are just sprouting up anywhere and everywhere. And how there was the real question that these banks issuing this paper money, if this money was really worth what these banks were saying it is. Now today, only the federal government reserves the right to print money, but at the time, individual banks could. And by their printing of this money, it helped finance the growth, manufacturing, and issuing loans to farmers. So how exactly did this paper money work? Well, basically, the paper money was a promissory note issued to the bank, guaranteeing the person who had the note could come into the bank and redeem that paper note for whatever it was worth in gold, specie. So banks had to have a certain amount of valuable metals, gold, silver, within the vaults before they could start issuing out the paper money. Of course, banks, like we know, are all honest institutions, and they would never dream of issuing out more money than what they actually had in the vaults. Yeah. What we saw was the reputation of a bank really rested on its honesty on whether the paper money was good or not. And what we saw was not very many banks were seen as being honest, because a lot of people were not really sure the paper notes that they had in their possession was really worth what it was saying. So again, the U.S. bank was meant to keep these smaller banks honest by collecting this money. Eventually would come into their vaults, and what the U.S. bank would do to make sure these banks were honest would go and ask for the money in return for gold. So the U.S. bank would redeem this paper money. However, if these banks were seen as not being able to redeem the money, of course, they would be closed down. So again, the U.S. bank again accumulates a lot of this paper money, and it's meant to keep these smaller banks honest. And I pretty much just covered that. What happens is, one of the reasons that the U.S. bank becomes involved in this public resentment is kind of the first depression we get into in the country. And we don't really call them depressions, we call them panics. What happens is, after the war, there is this kind of speculative fever that hits the United States. What am I talking about? Investing in stocks and in companies. At the end of the war, really, there's an overseas market for American grain and wheat, and cotton, excuse me. Keep in mind, Europe has just finished with Napoleonic Wars. It's pretty much devastated, and they want our farm goods. So this, in turn, inspires our farmers to go out, try to get as much more land as they can to grow cotton and grow their various products. They take out loans from banks to buy the land. And so what we see is there's starting to be this bubble forming within the U.S. economy based on the selling of these farm goods. So our local banks, even the branches of the U.S. Bank, were more than happy to extend loans out to people. So what happens is by 1819, the bubble burst. Europeans no longer need our goods. They're back on their feet. Things are returning back to normal in Europe. And with that, the need no longer there for our goods, our economy just kind of falls apart in a sense. Demand for land, right? Farmers wanting to go out, buy land, produce crops, sell them to Europe. The need for the land was no longer there, so kind of the real estate market fell through. And what we saw was people who were speculating in this land, right, selling and buying this land, lost millions of dollars. Banks started calling in their loans, and at the time, there wasn't a set period that a loan had to be paid back. If the bank extended you a loan one day, they could technically come and knock on your door and demand payment right then. If you couldn't, they would foreclose and take whatever collateral that you submitted for the loan. So what we saw was the U.S. Bank, again, was meant to keep these state banks honest. They didn't do it. And what happens is farmers and businessmen are forced to declare bankruptcy. And if you remember, we were talking about the growth of the market revolution within the United States. So what we see now is unemployment greatly rises in eastern cities, right, where we're having this manufacturing going on. And like I said, this is the first real financial crisis that we have in the United States, our first real depression. But they don't call them depressions. They're referred to as panics at this time. So what do the states do in response to this? Places like Kentucky call for kind of the suspension of debt collections at the time, and they begin printing out money, inflation to help their citizens. Other states retaliate in different ways. One kind of key episode is the state of Maryland. Maryland actually sues a branch of, not sues, but taxes a branch of the Bank of the United States within their state borders. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And what happens is the court says, under the necessary and proper clause, a legitimate exercise of congressional authority had been proven in establishing this bank. And basically, that Maryland could not tax the bank. The state could not tax the federal government. And so this ruling by the Supreme Court was kind of seen as a contradiction to the strict constructionist view. So again, what we see from out of this panic with McCulloch versus Maryland is states really lack the authority to destroy an agency created by the national government. So this is kind of one of those things that comes out of out of this panic. So it'd be like, I don't know, the state of Texas suing a branch of the IRS. So again, this establishes that states can't tax or try to destroy a branch of the federal government in their states. All right, guys, that's the end of part 3. I'll be posting part 4 soon. Thanks, and have a good day.